It began like any other ordinary morning in a quiet Connecticut suburb, the kind of neighborhood where front yards are neatly trimmed, where mothers push strollers down winding sidewalks, and where people leave their doors unlocked, trusting in routine and familiarity. But something was off that day, not loudly, not obviously, just off. Jessica Edwards was not the kind of person to disappear. At 22 years old, she had her hands full with a newborn son, a nursing program to return to, and a fragile marriage that she was trying, desperately, to hold together. She was determined, intelligent, and as her family would later insist, far too grounded to simply walk away without a word. That morning, her car sat in the driveway. Her purse, phone, and keys remained inside the house. The baby, only 7 months old, was in his crib, but Jessica was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture. Her shoes were still lined up near the door. There was nothing in the scene to suggest panic or violence, at least nothing obvious, and yet her absence was immediately alarming to those who knew her. Jessica had made plans for that day. She was supposed to attend a class, speak with her mother, and pick up groceries. She was a woman who followed through. She did not vanish into thin air. Her family reported her missing soon after calls to her phone went unanswered. They drove to her apartment and were greeted by silence. What struck them first wasn't just that she wasn't there, but that everything was too quiet, too clean. The atmosphere in the home felt scrubbed, not just physically, but emotionally, as if someone had tried to erase more than just presence. Her mother later recalled a heaviness in the air that she couldn't explain, a gut instinct that something terrible had happened. Her husband, Taj Hutchinson, initially claimed they had an argument that morning. According to him, Jessica had walked out after the dispute and didn't say where she was going. He said he thought she just needed space, that she would be back. But even in the early hours of the case, certain inconsistencies began to surface. Why hadn't he called her family to check if she was safe? Why didn't he report her missing? And why was her phone left behind if she had supposedly walked out? Nothing aligned. The basic facts of his story were riddled with quiet contradictions. Jessica's family pushed for answers. They began circulating flyers, mobilizing on social media, urging anyone with information to come forward. The community responded quickly. Local news outlets ran segments. Volunteers joined searches in nearby parks and wooded areas. Yet despite the rising attention, no one had seen Jessica. No neighbors remembered her leaving the apartment that day. Security footage from nearby homes showed no trace of her exiting the building or entering a car. Law enforcement soon joined the search. They treated the case with urgency. Missing adult cases, particularly those without signs of violence, are often difficult to escalate. But something about this one felt different. The detectives could sense the fracture behind the story being offered to them. They began compiling Jessica's background, school records, recent text messages, call history, social connections. Her life painted the picture of a young woman trying to rebuild. She had recently returned to her studies after giving birth. She was caring for her infant and staying in regular contact with her family and friends. She had goals, structure, and routine. Detectives also began to look at the dynamics of her marriage. There were indications, small but notable, of strain. Jessica had confided in friends about arguments. There were mentions of controlling behavior, emotional distance, late-night calls where her voice trembled but she insisted everything was fine. What she hadn't said publicly was now being pieced together privately. Investigators noted the common patterns in domestic abuse cases that often escalate without visible warning. Isolation, gaslighting, subtle threats, dependency, all too familiar and yet rarely acted upon until it was too late. Back at the apartment, nothing made sense. The infant child had been cared for, diapers had been changed, bottles used, but no trace of Jessica. If she had left voluntarily, she wouldn't have left the baby behind. If she had planned something, someone would have known. But there were no calls, no messages, no activity from her phone or financial accounts. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that Jessica's disappearance wasn't a choice. It was an act, a calculated removal from her life. But the question remained, who was responsible, and how had they erased her presence so completely? In many cases of domestic homicide, the crime scene does not scream violence. It whispers silence. There is no shattered glass or blood trail. There is absence. The absence of the victim, of course, but also the absence of explanation, of urgency from those closest, of human reaction. That absence is what investigators recognized here. The first chapter of this case closed not with a body, not with a confession, but with a void. A young woman gone, a husband offering few answers, and a family grasping for hope in the silence left behind. But soon, silence would turn into evidence, and evidence would tell the truth. As the hours passed without contact from Jessica Edwards, the atmosphere shifted from concern to quiet dread. Within her family, hope gave way to a grim realization. Something had gone wrong, not in a distant hypothetical sense, but tangibly dangerously wrong. Her mother was the first to sound the alarm, not because Jessica missed a phone call, young mothers are often busy, but because she hadn't followed up on scheduled plans. She hadn't checked in about the baby, she hadn't responded to messages, and more importantly, she hadn't been herself in recent days. When law enforcement officers first arrived at the residence, they noted the stillness. No forced entry, no overt sign of struggle. The baby was unharmed, fed, and resting. There was a sterile order to the place, almost too composed. But trained eyes noticed subtle signs, the absence of bedding on the couple's bed, the scent of cleaning agents still lingering in the air, and minor disruptions that suggested recent agitation rather than routine living. Initial questions fell on the last person to see her, her husband. He stated plainly that they had argued that morning and she had walked out. He suggested she needed time to cool off. The statement itself wasn't suspicious. Conflict in marriages is common, but it was delivered with a tone and timing that didn't sit well with investigators. He hadn't reported her missing. That duty fell to her family. He hadn't called friends or hospitals to check if she was safe, nor had he reached out to her school or attempted to track her down. For someone claiming to be deeply concerned, his lack of urgency contradicted the weight of the situation. Police began conducting interviews with neighbors. No one had seen Jessica leave that morning. No one had noticed anything out of place. A neighbor directly across the way recalled seeing her car in the driveway all morning. No one observed her entering another vehicle. No camera footage captured any activity at the usual departure time. She had simply vanished. Meanwhile, detectives requested access to digital records, text messages, emails, call logs. A pattern slowly emerged. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Jessica had communicated with close friends about tension at home. Not explicitly abuse, but control. Not bruises, but pressure. She felt monitored, second-guessed, and emotionally worn. Still, there were no formal reports of domestic violence. Like many in similar situations, she had normalized the discomfort. One friend had exchanged messages with her the night before she disappeared. Jessica had expressed exhaustion, not from motherhood, but from the emotional strain. "He gets so cold when we fight," she had written. "Sometimes I just shut down." It wasn't a cry for help, it was a statement of resignation. The case took on deeper urgency. Missing adults aren't always given priority, especially when there's no overt indication of criminal activity. But investigators recognize warning signs from experience. Women don't just leave newborns behind without a trace. They don't vanish into silence unless silenced. Search teams began canvassing nearby woods and trails. Jessica's image appeared on flyers taped to telephone poles, pinned to grocery store boards, shared in community Facebook groups. Her mother gave a plea to local media, urging anyone with information to come forward. "She's out there," she said, her voice steady. "And she didn't choose this." From an investigative standpoint, the strategy shifted from a standard missing person search to a potential foul play scenario. Behind the scenes, search warrants were prepared for digital devices, home surveillance systems, and financial records. Investigators knew the critical window was closing fast. The longer the trail stayed cold, the harder it would be to determine what had happened and who was responsible. Yet even in the absence of a suspect or confession, professionals knew how these cases often played out. The majority of women who go missing under similar circumstances are later found dead. The odds were against Jessica, but her family refused to give up. Neither did the detectives. What made this case particularly haunting wasn't the spectacle of violence. It was the void, the normalcy, the mundane surface concealing something far more sinister underneath. The life of a young mother, quiet and unassuming, now entirely erased from her own home. As forensic specialists reviewed the environment and data analysts traced movement histories, a clearer timeline would begin to form. But in this chapter of the case, it was still absence that spoke the loudest. And behind that absence, the growing suspicion that Jessica's story hadn't ended when she walked out the door, but somewhere much closer to home. In the investigation of a disappearance, the first layer is always the obvious. Where was the person last seen? Who reported them missing? What physical evidence remains? But the next layer is quieter, and in cases like Jessica Edwards, far more telling. That layer is the victim's life before the disappearance, the patterns, the relationships, and the subtle warnings no one recognized in time. By the third day, law enforcement had already shifted their approach. Jessica was no longer being treated as simply missing. She was now considered endangered. There had been no activity on her phone, no credit card transactions, no communication through email or social media. More importantly, there were no signs that she had prepared to leave, no packed bags, no ride arranged, no conversations hinting at escape. Investigators turned their attention to the marriage. Jessica and her husband had not been together long. They had met during her college years and moved in together shortly before the birth of their son. At a glance, they appeared to be like many young couples, figuring things out as they went, trying to balance parenthood with the pressures of school, work, and growing financial demands. But underneath that ordinary facade was something far less stable. Through interviews with Jessica's friends, investigators started collecting fragments of private conversations and concerns that had never reached the surface. Multiple people confirmed that Jessica had expressed frustration and exhaustion in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Not from motherhood, that part, they said, she embraced with pride, but from the feeling of being watched, second-guessed, and emotionally cornered. One friend described Jessica's partner as charming to everyone else, but different at home. Others noted that she had stopped joining group chats, missed social outings, and hesitated to speak openly even in private. There was no dramatic outburst, no single cry for help. Instead, there was withdrawal, a slow retreat inward that now seemed painfully significant. Digital records further confirmed a troubling shift. Her search history included phrases related to domestic pressure, relationship stress, and parenting while isolated. Her text messages, while carefully worded, suggested emotional exhaustion. "I feel like I can't breathe in my own home," she had typed once, weeks before she vanished. Investigators understood what this meant. In domestic abuse cases, the absence of physical violence often masks the depth of control. Psychological manipulation, coercive behavior, and isolation tactics rarely leave bruises, but they can be just as dangerous. In fact, studies consistently show that psychological control is one of the most consistent precursors to lethal domestic incidents. In her college records, Jessica was listed as an attentive student. Professors spoke of her determination and sharp mind. Her academic performance was consistent even after giving birth. She had every intention of returning to class full-time. This wasn't someone who was overwhelmed or unstable. This was someone with plans, someone building towards something, until, suddenly, she was gone. What also troubled investigators was how quickly the emotional climate around Jessica's relationship became clear to outsiders once they began asking the right questions. People who had been close to her, but hesitant to interfere, were now expressing regret. "She didn't want to make it seem worse than it was," one friend said. "I think she didn't want us to worry." Regret is common in these cases. It grows in the silence left behind by victims who minimize their own suffering, who stay for the child, who hope things will improve. Jessica had voiced doubts, but, like so many others, she had kept those concerns quiet, likely out of fear, shame, or the burden of loyalty. Investigators built a profile, not just of the missing woman, but of the environment she lived in. They examined phone records, texts, and social media logs. They looked for patterns: who she contacted most, when the last messages were sent, which locations she had recently visited. And they built timelines, not just for Jessica, but for the people closest to her. They paid special attention to any significant behavior shifts in her husband. In particular, they began checking his digital footprint, where he had been, who he had called, what items he had purchased before and after the disappearance. Any inconsistencies would be noted, flagged, and quietly pursued, but they didn't move fast. In cases like these, the integrity of the investigation depends on patience. Rushing a confrontation risks alerting a suspect. The priority was to collect hard evidence, data that couldn't be disputed, movements that couldn't be explained away. The suspicion was forming, but suspicion isn't enough. What they needed was confirmation. Behind closed doors, Jessica's family began piecing things together in their own way. Old arguments, comments that didn't make sense at the time, moments where Jessica seemed on edge but brushed off concern. For many families, these realizations arrive like aftershocks, one memory triggering another, each one harder to accept than the last. Jessica hadn't reached out for formal help. She hadn't filed reports or visited shelters, and that too was part of the tragedy, because by the time a victim is gone, it's often too late to protect them. All that remains is the story left behind and the effort to tell it completely, to make it matter. The investigators continued quietly, gathering data, watching closely. Jessica had disappeared, but her silence was beginning to speak. The fractures in her marriage, once buried beneath the surface, were starting to show, and soon, those fractures would lead to something concrete. By day 4, Jessica Edwards had not returned home, had not contacted friends or family, and had left no sign of movement in the digital world. Investigators no longer referred to her case in conditional terms. Internally, they were working under the assumption that she had not simply vanished, something had been done to her. The mission was no longer about waiting, it was about finding. Search protocols moved swiftly from localized efforts to a coordinated response. Law enforcement began mapping out her last known movements, not by eyewitnesses, but through hard data. Every time she used her phone, sent a text, or connected to Wi-Fi, a record had been left behind. That trail, however faint, was their strongest lead. Jessica's phone had gone silent the morning she was reported missing. Its signal dropped off shortly after 7 a.m. and had not reconnected to any tower since. Investigators subpoenaed GPS data from service providers and began cross-referencing those records with any known routes, especially roads near wooded or isolated areas. South Windsor, despite being a suburban community, was bordered by stretches of dense forest and underdeveloped land, terrain that could easily conceal evidence or worse. Simultaneously, search teams expanded their physical sweep. Officers, search and rescue volunteers, and cadaver dogs were deployed to nearby parks, riverbanks, and wooded trails. These areas were not chosen randomly. They were identified based on geographic profiling, behavior patterns, and specific location data collected from Jessica's known contacts. Still, despite the growing scale, progress remained slow. Each field search required hours of effort, combing through acres of thick brush, uneven terrain, and discarded debris. Every promising clue, torn fabric, tire tracks, a faint odor, had to be examined thoroughly and logged. Most of them led nowhere. It was during this phase that local media coverage surged. Community members organized vigils. Social media campaigns called for public assistance. Flyers bearing Jessica's photo were pinned to church bulletin boards, gas station windows, and the windshields of parked cars. The pressure to find her mounted with each passing hour, and so did the scrutiny on those closest to her. Public interest served two purposes. It mobilized support, but it also unearthed memories. A former classmate contacted the police to share a brief, recent interaction with Jessica. She had seemed unusually anxious and vague about her home life. Another neighbor recalled hearing raised voices a few nights prior. Nothing seemed serious at the time, but in hindsight, each detail became part of a larger pattern. Behind the scenes, investigators continued to quietly monitor the people in Jessica's immediate circle. Without naming suspects, they began reviewing alibis. Who was home that morning? Who had contact with her hours before her phone went dark? What was said and when? They revisited the apartment she shared with her husband, focusing this time on subtle forensic evidence. Luminol tests were conducted in key areas, especially the bedroom, bathroom, and entry points. The results did not scream foul play, but they did not rule it out either. Certain inconsistencies began to raise flags. A section of carpet that had been freshly shampooed, a missing set of bed linens, a trash bag discarded before the family reported her missing, now unrecoverable. And then there was the digital footprint, not hers, but others. Online purchases were cross-checked, device activity analyzed. One particular receipt stood out. A purchase made just before Jessica went missing, containing materials that didn't fit with routine household needs. Nothing illegal, but context is everything. When timing aligns too closely, it becomes data. When that data matches behavior, it becomes evidence. Still, the public narrative remained controlled. Law enforcement did not release key findings. Doing so could compromise the investigation, or worse, spook a person of interest. Investigators knew they were building a case where circumstantial weight would matter as much as physical proof. They had to be deliberate, no step rushed, no assumption taken as fact until confirmed through triangulation, statements, surveillance, location data, and forensics. On the ground, Jessica's family continued their own efforts. Her mother organized a second community search, this time covering trails not previously canvassed. A cousin managed a digital awareness campaign, collecting tips through anonymous channels. Leads trickled in, some hopeful, some harmful. One anonymous message claimed to know where she had been taken. Another hinted at an argument that turned violent. Each tip was logged, verified, and followed, regardless of credibility. At this stage, what began as a disappearance had transformed into a multi-layered investigation. Not a single suspect had been publicly named, no arrests made. Yet those involved in the search felt the weight of something unspoken, something just beneath the surface. The sense that the answer wasn't out there somewhere. It had always been closer than anyone wanted to admit. In cases like this, investigators are trained to follow three dimensions: space, time, and behavior. Where was the victim last seen? At what moment did things begin to deviate from the norm? And who, based on action or inaction, has something to lose? The answers were coming together, not in the form of sudden breakthroughs, but through persistence, patterns, and silence. In missing persons investigations, most searches fail not because evidence is absent, but because the smallest inconsistencies are overlooked. By the time Jessica Edwards had been gone for nearly a week, the case was no longer centered on what was missing. It was focused on what remained: quiet irregularities that didn't fit within the rhythm of everyday life. Detectives returned to the Edwards residence for a second forensic sweep, this time with more targeted intent. Their first visit had been observational. The second was analytical. They no longer needed to ask what had happened. They were now asking how it had been hidden. Every detail was revisited. The bedroom showed signs of recent cleaning, too recent for routine behavior, especially in a household managing a newborn. Fibers collected from the vacuum were sent to the lab. A missing fitted sheet was noted in the inventory. There was no visible blood, but luminol tests revealed faint traces of biological material along the baseboards and behind furniture. Not enough to prove anything definitively, but enough to suggest disturbance. Investigators mapped out the movements of every individual connected to Jessica during the 48-hour window surrounding her disappearance. While her digital footprint ended abruptly, the same was not true for those around her. Cell phone tower data was pulled. GPS pings from devices and connected vehicles were overlaid onto satellite maps. One particular set of coordinates raised concern: a brief, early morning detour to a remote wooded area nearly 15 miles away. Not part of anyone's known routine, not explained in interviews, just a blip, but a blip that mattered. They reviewed surveillance footage from gas stations and traffic intersections in the vicinity. A vehicle matching the make and model associated with the household was recorded at odd hours, driving in areas that weren't on the usual commute. At a convenience store, a blurry, time-stamped image captured a figure purchasing garbage bags and cleaning supplies. The date on the receipt aligned almost exactly with the moment Jessica stopped responding to messages. Individually, none of these points meant guilt, but collectively, they formed a timeline. Not the timeline of a disappearance, but of a cover-up. The forensic lab results confirmed the presence of human DNA in the vacuum canister, consistent with Jessica's profile, though not conclusive enough to confirm injury. Analysis of the air filter in the family's vehicle returned elevated traces of organic residue, suggesting that someone, had been transported under unusual conditions. Meanwhile, the child's routine offered its own insight. Investigators quietly interviewed the pediatrician and daycare providers. Despite the turbulence at home, Jessica had always kept consistent appointments. She showed up on time. She asked questions. But the week she vanished, there were no calls to reschedule, no missed voicemails, just silence. And the infant, while physically unharmed, was found to have gone nearly a full day without feeding, a break from the highly structured care Jessica maintained. In the background, pressure mounted. Media speculation grew more pointed. Community members began voicing quiet suspicion. Behind closed doors, even those closest to the family started expressing doubts. Investigators, still withholding key information, kept the public narrative restrained, but internally, they were closing gaps quickly. One overlooked detail shifted the pace entirely. While combing through footage from a neighbor's security camera, an officer noticed something odd. The camera faced the rear of the complex, not where most foot traffic occurred. But in the early morning hours of the day, Jessica vanished. A faint silhouette passed through the frame. The figure was dragging something long and low to the ground, too pixelated to confirm identity, but the timestamp aligned with the unexplained vehicle movement. From that moment, the investigation was no longer speculative. Teams were redirected to the wooded area flagged by the earlier GPS analysis. The location was dense, overgrown, and largely unvisited. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they began canvassing the zone quadrant by quadrant. It was slow work, measured, deliberate, methodical, but law enforcement knew what they were looking for now. They weren't hoping to find Jessica. They were expecting to. And for the first time since her disappearance, hope began to fade. The shift from suspicion to certainty in a criminal investigation rarely happens in a single moment. It's incremental, measured in converging data points, not confessions. And in the case of Jessica Edwards, it was the forest that finally began to speak. Following the GPS analysis, law enforcement identified a remote patch of wooded land east of the residential area where Jessica lived. The coordinates had been flagged days earlier, but lacked the support to justify a full-scale search. Now, with mounting anomalies in movement patterns and the eerie silhouette on the neighbor's footage, the evidence aligned tightly enough to justify excavation. This wasn't a recreational trail or public park. It was a semi-wild zone, a forgotten fragment of land pressed between suburban development and underused industrial roads. The terrain was unkempt, the foliage thick from spring growth, and the paths nearly invisible without aerial guidance. Authorities coordinated a systematic grid search using drone surveillance to scan for irregularities in vegetation, soil depressions, or debris. Ground units moved slowly through assigned sections, pausing for every fragment out of place: broken branches, displaced rocks, plastic coverings, torn material caught in brambles. Search and rescue dogs trained for human remains were brought in. These animals don't react to scent the way most imagine. They work with precision, responding to trace odors that the human nose could never perceive. Within minutes of being deployed, one dog sat still at a location just off the main path, a subtle action, but unmistakable to its handler. Another joined moments later, the same spot. Investigators marked the area and began preliminary excavation, careful not to disturb surrounding evidence. What they uncovered was a shallow burial site. Beneath layers of soft earth and loosely packed brush, the outline of a human form began to emerge, wrapped in cloth, partially decomposed, and positioned in a way that suggested haste, not care. There was no doubt. The search for a missing person had just become a homicide investigation. Confirmation came swiftly through physical identifiers, jewelry, dental records, clothing consistent with what Jessica was last known to be wearing. A forensic pathologist was brought in to oversee the recovery and maintain chain of custody protocols. The remains were transported under secure escort to the medical examiner's office for post-mortem analysis. Word did not reach the public immediately. Out of respect for the family and to protect the investigation's integrity, officials delayed the release of information. But among those working the case, the atmosphere shifted. What had once been theory was now reality. The kind of reality that leaves no room for doubt, only for truth. For Jessica's loved ones, the confirmation was both a breaking point and an unwanted relief. They had clung to hope for days, hope that she had fled, or was hiding, or had simply needed space. But now, reality required reckoning. The mother who had begged for her daughter's safe return was now making arrangements to receive her body. The forensic autopsy took several days. The findings were grim. Cause of death: asphyxia due to compression of the neck and torso. There were signs of restraint, indicative of prolonged force rather than momentary violence. No defensive wounds suggested that Jessica had been overpowered before she could resist. The positioning of the body and post-mortem indicators confirmed that she had been deceased for over a week, consistent with the morning she was last seen. Trace evidence collected from the burial site added further weight: fibers matching those found in the couple's home, soil embedded in the shoes of a known associate, and remnants of household cleaning products near the body, subtle signatures of an attempt to erase, conceal, control. In parallel, investigators revisited prior interviews. Individuals who had previously appeared helpful were now asked to clarify timelines and re-explain their whereabouts. Minor inconsistencies became significant under the pressure of new facts: a receipt timestamp, a deleted text, a 20-minute window unaccounted for. These gaps, once vague, were now critical. Digital evidence began telling its own story. Phone activity traced to the burial site in the early hours of the morning. Vehicle tracking data matching the exact route to the wooded area. Search histories that included phrases such as "how deep to bury" and how long before a body smells. Not assumptions, documented activity. As this new chapter unfolded, the focus shifted from what happened to who did it and why. And though public announcements remained limited, internally, investigators were preparing for confrontation. They had the body. They had a cause of death. They had a digital and forensic trail. The challenge now was making it undeniable. What lingered through all of this was not just the grief, but the weight of the silence that had followed Jessica's disappearance. The silence from those who should have known. The silence of those who did. Cases like these don't resolve quietly. They end with courtrooms, media headlines, and long-term consequences. But before all that comes the work. Patient, meticulous, and unrelenting, Jessica had been found. But her story was far from over. When a body is found, it doesn't just confirm a crime, it alters the entire structure of the investigation. What was once an open-ended search becomes an increasingly focused pursuit. The ambiguity surrounding Jessica Edwards' disappearance had finally collapsed under the weight of hard forensic evidence. Now investigators could move with sharper precision, but they knew better than to treat discovery as resolution. Discovery only intensifies the stakes. Behind closed doors, a new strategy was activated. Everything collected so far, every search record, every movement log, every inconsistency was laid out on a timeline. The goal was to trace not just where Jessica had gone, but who had engineered her silence. The forensic findings from the medical examiner were comprehensive. Compression injuries to the neck and back, consistent with being restrained or pinned, no blunt trauma, no stabbing, no gunshot wounds. Instead, this was a killing that relied on pressure and control, both physical and psychological. The absence of defensive wounds suggested a rapid incapacitation, not a prolonged struggle. For investigators familiar with patterns of domestic homicide, this method of killing was disturbingly familiar, silent, personal, deliberate. Additional samples taken from beneath the victim's fingernails were tested. They yielded trace DNA, not enough for immediate indictment, but enough to warrant comparison against known individuals in Jessica's inner circle. The samples were preserved, documented, and processed with utmost care. Any contamination could compromise the case. Meanwhile, investigators turned their attention back to inconsistencies in previously collected statements. A key principle in criminal profiling is that behavior after the crime often reveals more than the crime itself. In this case, the post-disappearance behavior of individuals close to Jessica was scrutinized with renewed intensity. One individual, initially cooperative, had since grown guarded. Requests for voluntary interviews were now deflected or postponed. Digital records, once offered without question, were now being lawyered. The shift in demeanor didn't confirm guilt, but it signaled discomfort under scrutiny. Detectives examined phone records from the 24-hour window following Jessica's disappearance. One device in particular showed unusual activity, multiple searches for cleaning agents, routes to wooded areas, disposal tips. In isolation, these would be questionable. In context, they were damning. A traffic camera from a nearby highway entrance captured a vehicle matching the registered make and model of someone close to Jessica leaving town at 4:17 a.m., hours before the missing persons report was filed. The timestamp aligned almost perfectly with the GPS ping from the burial site. Investigators compared tire tread impressions recovered from the wooded area to those from the vehicle. A forensic match was confirmed. The margin for coincidence was gone. While all of this unfolded behind the scenes, Jessica's family had begun preparing for a memorial. The mood in the community shifted from urgent hope to quiet grief. Candlelight vigils replaced flyers. In local churches, her name was spoken in prayer. People still wanted justice, but they now mourned with the knowledge that Jessica wouldn't be coming home. Yet what remained most pressing to those building the case was not just securing a conviction, it was understanding the sequence of decisions that had led here. Why her? Why now? What pushed someone from control to elimination? In cases like this, motive often hides behind emotion, resentment, rage, fear of exposure. But these motives don't typically emerge in a single outburst. They build slowly from frustration, entitlement, or escalating paranoia. Jessica's silence had been permanent, but her life had been documenting its own history all along, through messages, schedules, choices, and ultimately her absence. Prosecutors joined strategy meetings. If a suspect were to be arrested, they needed the strongest possible presentation of cause, means, and opportunity. Investigators compiled digital records, surveillance footage, forensic analyses, behavioral assessments, and a timeline of post-crime conduct into a cohesive package. Every detail was cross-referenced, every gap filled. The critical threshold had been reached. A case could now be made that was not based on speculation, but on converging evidence that could withstand judicial scrutiny. Still, investigators proceeded cautiously. Arresting someone too early could jeopardize the case. Holding someone too late could risk escape or manipulation. Timing in cases like these is as strategic as any piece of proof. So they waited, quietly, watching, listening, planning. Meanwhile, the community held on to a different kind of urgency. Jessica's story had touched more than just those who knew her. Her case became a symbol, a cautionary tale about the dangers of invisible violence, the kind that leaves no obvious scars but shatters lives just the same. As the days stretched on, the pressure behind the scenes reached a boiling point. The truth was no longer hidden. It was organized, categorized, and ready for court. What came next would change lives, permanently. The arrest came not with a dramatic standoff, but with a knock at the door and a quiet directive: come with us. By the time investigators made their move, every element of their case was ready, collected, corroborated, and connected. The person brought in had not yet been charged with murder, but law enforcement was prepared to present the full weight of evidence. The interrogation was calculated, not coercive. Investigators understood the psychological terrain they were operating on. They didn't ask, "Did you do it?" Instead, they asked about timelines, inconsistencies, and motivations. At every turn, they laid out the data: GPS pings, forensic matches, surveillance images, and search histories. The suspect began with denial, flat, rehearsed, and predictable. But as the details came forward, one after another, the wall began to crack. There were no outbursts, no dramatic confessions, just a slow erosion of the narrative that had been maintained since Jessica vanished. First came the admission that they had argued. Then came a shift in tone, an acknowledgement that things got out of hand. Details emerged about the morning in question, presented carefully, often deflected with vague terms like accident or panic. The story was shaped to soften the facts, to protect from the full consequences of the truth. But the physical evidence was indifferent to explanation. It spoke louder than any words offered across the table. With a confession in hand, partial, evasive, but admissible, prosecutors moved swiftly to secure formal charges. The court proceedings were scheduled, and the case entered a new phase: public scrutiny, legal strategy, and emotional reckoning. The trial itself was not long, but it was exhaustive. Over several days, the prosecution laid out the full scope of events, from the final communications Jessica sent, to the search and discovery of her remains, to the digital trail that showed intent, preparation, and concealment. Every timeline was verified, every piece of evidence backed by scientific analysis or first-hand testimony. Jessica's family sat through each session. They listened to descriptions of the last moments of her life with silent grief, not seeking revenge, but resolution. Her mother, who had become the face of public appeals during the search, now sat still as photos of the burial site were displayed in court. The defense argued for mitigation. They pointed to stress, emotional strain, lack of prior violent behavior. But these arguments struggled to stand against the mountain of detail. This wasn't a momentary lapse, it was a sequence of decisions that culminated in death, concealment, and deception. When the verdict came, the courtroom was still. Guilty, on charges of first-degree manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and risk of injury to a minor. A 27-year sentence was handed down. The judge's remarks were direct. No sentence could restore what had been taken, but this was the system's attempt at accountability. After the sentencing, the attention of the media faded, as it always does, but the consequences did not. Jessica's infant son, now under the care of her family, would grow up without either parent. He would someday learn about the trial, the loss, and the silence that followed. Her mother continued to advocate publicly, not for punishment, but for awareness. She spoke at schools, shelters, and community centers, warning others to listen closely when someone says they feel unsafe, even if there are no bruises. The apartment where Jessica had lived was eventually vacated. The name faded from headlines, replaced by the next tragedy. But among those who had investigated the case and those who had lived through its aftermath, the memory endured, not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in how quickly control can turn fatal, and how many signals are only recognized when it's too late. No case ends neatly. There are no full resolutions in the aftermath of violence, only consequences, often generational. Jessica's story didn't conclude with the verdict. It echoed in the child she left behind, in the community that tried to find her, and in every unanswered question about how it could have been prevented. The final pages of any case file are rarely satisfying. They contain conclusions but not closure. They document outcomes but not healing. Jessica Edwards's case closed with a conviction, but it remains open in every life altered by her absence. As investigators boxed up reports and archived photographs, the question they kept circling back to wasn't, who did it? That had already been answered. The more haunting question was, what did we miss? Jessica had shown signs, subtle, quiet, familiar to those trained to see them, yet invisible in the noise of everyday life. She hadn't spoken of bruises or broken bones. She hadn't run to a shelter or called a hotline. Her suffering came through hesitation, retreat, a soft withdrawal from the people who knew her best. Control wasn't exercised through violence but through presence, always watching, always judging, until her autonomy dissolved behind a closed door. Cases like Jessica's illuminate a dangerous truth. Psychological control often precedes physical harm. The manipulation of a partner's emotions, isolation from friends, the gradual erasure of self-esteem. These tactics rarely make headlines, but they form the foundation of many intimate partner homicides. And unlike physical abuse, emotional control leaves no visible trace. Victims doubt their own reality. They stay because they fear judgment, not just violence. They minimize, they rationalize. And those around them, even well-meaning friends and family, may look the other way, out of discomfort, confusion, or disbelief. Jessica had dreams. She was a nursing student, a new mother, a daughter, a friend. Her life was not marked by recklessness or instability. She was organized, responsible, committed to building a future for her child. And yet, she ended up buried in the woods, silenced by someone who once claimed to love her. This case stands not just as a record of loss, but as an indictment of silence, the kind that exists in homes, in communities, even in institutions that overlook patterns until it's too late. For law enforcement, it was a reminder that behavioral red flags, controlling language, social withdrawal, unexplained anxiety, must be taken as seriously as bruises and threats. For families and communities, it was a call to listen with more urgency when someone says they feel trapped, watched, or fearful in their own home. And for survivors still in the shadows, it underscored a painful but vital truth. If something feels wrong, it usually is. No legislation, no sentence, no investigation can undo what happened to Jessica. But what can endure is the clarity of her story, documented in evidence, carried in the voices of those she left behind, and taught as a cautionary case in classrooms and police academies. Her name became part of a larger conversation about how we define abuse, how we measure danger, and how we respond when the threat isn't obvious. Organizations cited her story in workshops on coercive control. Advocacy groups shared her timeline as an example of what to look for when someone starts to fade from their own life. Jessica Edwards did not die in vain. Her story was painful, but it forced conversations long overdue. It pushed policy discussions forward. It gave victims a name they could relate to, and it reminded everyone involved, from detectives to neighbors, that violence doesn't always start with fists. Sometimes it starts with silence, and if no one listens closely enough, that silence kills. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.